Imagine for a second that you are handed well, a highly finite window of time.
Right, like an hourglass just gets flipped.
Exactly. Let's say you're given exactly 6 months where that hourglass is flipped and time becomes completely unavoidably visible to you.
Yeah?
The question I really want to pose to you right now is, what do you do with those months? Like, what problem do you actually choose to solve?
Because, I mean, human nature is understandably to just retreat.
Right. You pull back, you spend time with family, maybe you go to a quiet beach, just completely shut out the noise of a chaotic world.
Which makes total sense.
It does. But what if you chose instead to lock the world's most powerful rival artificial intellects in a digital room together?
Wow.
And you force them to argue until a mathematically bulletproof set of laws emerges to, govern the entire future of the global economy.
That is, I mean, that's just a staggering pivot from what most people would do.
It really is. And that is exactly the premise we are exploring today in this deep dive. But before we get into the tech, it requires us to step into a very specific space.
Yeah, the environment is key here.
So as you are settling in with us, I want you to visualize where this work is actively happening right now. We're sitting in this incredibly bright, contemporary California apartment.
The light in here is just amazing.
Yeah, it's this golden morning light pouring in through these large windows. It casts these really gentle, warm shadows across the white walls.
You've got these crisp, clean lines of the light wood furniture all around us.
Right, and the vibrant green plants just breathing life into the corners of the room. It has this very calm, almost documentary-style aesthetic to it.
It feels incredibly open, modern, and above all, deeply hopeful.
Exactly. And we're setting this visual stage for you because that specific atmosphere, that bright, structured, profoundly human clarity, that is the exact thematic anchor for the architecture we are about to unpack.
It really serves as a complete mirror to the mindset we are exploring today.
Which is why our mission today is, well, it's a bit different from our standard technical breakdowns.
Yeah, we have a massive stack of highly complex architectural blueprints here. Research monographs, systems engineering schematics.
All detailing this framework known as ternary logic.
Right. But we aren't just going to hand you a dry technical manual on AI governance.
No, because to understand the tech, we have to look at the person behind the work. We are examining the mindset, the relentless motivation, and the actively evolving legacy of Lev Goukassian.
Because to understand the profound shift in computer science he is proposing, you really have to understand the relentlessly curious mind of the architect who is actively building it.
Right now, and that distinction is crucial. We are talking about a living thinker who is deeply, intensely intellectually engaged.
Yeah, he is pursuing what might literally be one of the heaviest, most monumental tasks of our generation.
Building an enforceable, ethical architecture for trillion-dollar AI and economic systems.
And he is doing all of this while living with advanced stage 4 cancer.
It's hard to wrap your head around. He has dedicated his visible time to a structural problem that the vast majority of the world doesn't even realize exists yet.
I mean, the tech industry right now is completely obsessed with speed and scale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here is a man looking at the fundamental bedrock of all of it and saying, this is completely flawed.
Because he is operating from a place of just overwhelming responsibility.
Yeah, there is a quote from his recent writings that I think really anchors the ethos of this entire deep dive.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
He writes, "I built this while time was visible. Come walk the path I walked."
That is so powerful. He is experiencing this state of intense, sustained, terminal lucidity. His intellect is completely independent.
And he's actively refining these ideas day by day.
Right, and he absolutely refuses to accept the superficial answers that the technology sector traditionally offers us when it comes to, AI safety.
Because the industry standard right now relies on things like post-training alignment, right?
Yeah.
Or these corporate safety boards.
Oh yeah, corporate safety boards that can be dissolved literally overnight if the board of directors gets nervous.
Exactly, and Lev looks at those and just sees them as paper shields.
They offer no real structural protection.
Let's try to puzzle through that motivation for a second, though, because if you are facing a severe medical reality, the physical and emotional toll is just immense.
Unimaginable, yeah.
So leaning into the friction of global economic governance, the friction of autonomous AI design, why choose the heaviest possible burden?
Right, why not just write a memoir? Or focus on a more localized, maybe personal project?
Exactly.
Well, I think for a mind structured like his, knowledge doesn't just sit passively in the brain. It creates an inescapable obligation.
An obligation to act.
Yeah. He looks at the macro trajectory of human development, and he recognizes that we are actively building, well, godlike systems.
We really are. We're giving artificial intelligence the power to route global logistics, to dictate financial markets.
To identify targets in military conflicts.
Yes. And we are deploying all of this on a foundational computational architecture that has massive structural blind spots.
And he sees these cracks in the foundation. Cracks that the major tech conglomerates are actively ignoring because, frankly, they are incentivized by the speed of construction.
They just want to build it faster than the next guy.
Exactly. And he realizes that if he doesn't use his visible time to design this ethical safety net right now, the cost of asking for it later is going to be staggering.
Because once these systems are fully autonomous and entrenched in our infrastructure, it's too late.
Right. As he puts it in one of his core essays, some battles begin the moment you decide not to look away.
The moment you decide not to look away, that really frames the entire endeavor.
It does.
He is sitting in a sunlit room, much like the one we are describing to you, looking directly into the blinding speed of technological acceleration and just refusing to blink.
Refusing to look away.
But let's talk about the logistics of how this is actively happening. Because one man, working from an apartment, is trying to build a constitutional system robust enough to govern systems that vastly outpace human cognition.
Right. He obviously can't write every single line of code by himself.
Yeah.
Or simulate every global economic variable.
No. So the source material describes this orchestration process. How does he actually develop the framework in practice?
So the blueprints outline this deeply iterative collaboration. The visual concept provided in the sources is described as the AI Symphony.
Okay, AI Symphony. Paint that picture for me.
So picture Lev at his desk, surrounded by a bank of high-resolution monitors.
Like a command center.
Exactly. And across these screens, he is simultaneously running the most advanced language and reasoning models available right now.
We're talking Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini.
Grok, Kimi, Qwen, DeepSeek, Ernie, all of them. You have millions of lines of code flowing across the displays, mapping out logic structures and economic game theory.
But he isn't just like asking them questions and writing down the answers, right?
No. He uses a custom methodology that he calls a stressing agent.
Wait, so a stressing agent, does that mean he creates a separate AI protocol whose only job is to attack the outputs of the other models?
Essentially, yes.
Like an automated devil's advocate.
That's a great way to put it. He feeds the output of one model directly into the critical pathway of another model, but he does it with specific architectural constraints.
So he's forcing them into conflict.
Yes. He is continuously challenging, refining, discarding, and rebuilding concepts. He explicitly notes this in his methodology. He says, I did not ask AIs to agree. I asked them to expose each other.
Expose each other. That is vital, right? Because large language models have this well-documented tendency toward sycophancy.
Oh, absolutely. They want to please the user.
Yeah, they tend to converge on this very polite middle-of-the-road consensus, and Lev just strips that completely away.
He isn't looking for polite consensus. He's looking for the structural breaking points in their logic.
I'm trying to picture the dynamic in that room. It really does sound like a constitutional convention.
It really does.
If you think about, 1787, they didn't just sit in a room and smile and agree with each other.
No, they argued over every single clause.
Right, trying to find the exploits in the proposed government. And Lev is locking the most powerful, divergent artificial intellects on the planet in a digital room and forcing them into this grueling cross-examination.
Until a mathematically sound set of laws emerges.
Wow.
And you have to realize the technology here is entirely subservient to the vision.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the artificial intelligence models, they make up the orchestra. They provide the raw computational scale. But Lev remains the architect and the conductor.
He's the one shaping the noise into music.
Exactly. He observes in his notes, a symphony is not many instruments playing together. It is many instruments restrained by architecture.
That word restrained feels so central to everything we are going to discuss today.
It is the absolute core of it. The goal isn't to make the AI faster or more creative. The goal is to figure out how to structurally restrain it when it matters most.
Okay, so when he sets these models against each other, asking them to expose the flaws in our current technological trajectory, what do they actually find?
Right.
Like, if you dig down past the user interfaces, past the algorithms, to the absolute bedrock of modern technology, what is the fatal flaw that Lev diagnoses?
Well, they isolated a phenomenon that Lev defines as binary brittleness.
But binary brittleness. Okay, let's unpack that.
To understand the magnitude of this, we really have to look at the epistemic crisis of our current era.
Yeah.
At the very bottom of almost all modern computing architecture, the logic is strictly binary.
Right, it stems from the fundamental physics of the transistor itself.
Exactly. A switch is either open or closed. The voltage is either high or low. It is a universe composed entirely of ones and zeros.
True or false? Proceed or refuse?
Yes.
So whether we are talking about like a basic pocket calculator or a high-frequency trading algorithm on Wall Street or a trillion-parameter neural network,
They are all fundamentally the same at the bottom.
they are all ultimately collapsing reality down into a binary state to make a final execution decision.
Fundamentally, yes. The execution logic is binary.
Wow. Okay.
And when a machine is forced to interact with the staggering complexity of the real world, where morality, economics, and human behavior are incredibly messy and nuanced, collapsing, that complexity into a binary choice creates extreme fragility.
Because the real world isn't a 1 or a 0.
Right, so the system is structurally forced to guess. It has to pick a side, 1 or 0, even when it lacks the evidentiary weight to make a safe determination.
It literally doesn't have a choice but to guess.
Exactly. It hallucinates certainty where none exists, simply because its underlying grammar does not possess a vocabulary for hesitation.
Hallucinating certainty because there is no vocabulary for hesitation. That makes total sense when you look at the historical failures cited in the research.
The sources give us some deeply unsettling real-world examples of what happens when binary logic governs high-stakes environments.
Yeah, let's look at the 2010 flash crash. You had these financial algorithms operating on binary execution logic.
Right.
And when anomalies appeared in the market data, they didn't have a mechanism to say, this data seems contradictory, let me pause and evaluate.
No, they just kept executing sell orders based on the skewed data.
Cascading into $1 trillion in market value being wiped out in a matter of minutes. Just because they couldn't hesitate.
Exactly. And the robo-debt scandal in Australia is another prime example of binary brittleness at scale.
Oh, right. Walk us through that one.
So the government deployed an automated income averaging system to detect welfare overpayments. The system compared data from 2 different tax and welfare agencies.
Okay.
But because it was operating on a binary mandate, meaning either a debt exists or it doesn't, when it encountered mismatched or incomplete data.
Let me guess, it didn't flag the file for a human to review it?
No. Because it couldn't handle uncertainty, it defaulted to certainty. It issued over 470,000 false debt notices to vulnerable citizens.
That is horrifying. 470,000.
The algorithms simply lack the capacity to say, the data is insufficient, I shouldn't act.
And the consequences extend far beyond just financial distress, you know? The sources bring up the Uber Tempe autonomous vehicle crash.
Yeah, that's a tragic one.
The car's sensor fusion system was struggling to classify what was in front of it. It cycled through identifying the object as a vehicle, then maybe it's a bicycle, then just an unknown object.
The classification was totally unstable.
Highly unstable. But the binary execution system, the part that actually decides whether to hit the brakes or maintain speed, it didn't interpret that instability as a reason to halt.
Because it's just looking for a 1 or a 0.
Right. It just kept trying to force the unstable data into a binary proceed or refuse pipeline until it was too late.
And we see this in military applications too, which is even scarier.
Yeah, the drone swarms.
Right. The Cargo 2 autonomous drone, which was documented operating in Libya, this is a lethal weapon system programmed to identify and engage targets.
And it's built on binary logic.
Yes. So it has no internal structural mechanism to say, the identification of this human as a lawful combatant is only at a 60% confidence threshold, which is too low for lethal action, so I must withhold fire pending human determination.
It can't think like that.
No. If the threshold tips over the programmed line, the binary switch just flips to proceed, it engages.
Because binary logic gives the machine exactly 2 endpoints. Shoot or don't shoot. Approve the loan or deny the loan. Accelerate or brake.
Exactly.
So if the root cause of these catastrophic failures is the lack of a vocabulary for hesitation,
Right.
how does Lev solve it? What is the actual foundation of ternary logic?
Well, it begins with what is called the Goukassian vow.
The Goukassian vow.
Right. This is the philosophical bedrock that informs the hardware architecture. The vow is comprised of 3 short sentences.
Let's hear it.
It states, pause when truth is uncertain, refuse when harm is clear, proceed where truth is.
Okay, let's break that down. Proceed
Okay.
where truth is,
All right.
refuse when harm is clear, and pause when truth is uncertain. It sounds profound. I mean, it really does.
Hmm.
But how do you actually move from a philosophical vow to hard computer science?
That's the challenge, right?
Because a corporation can put a vow like that on a beautiful bronze plaque in their lobby, but it doesn't mean the server farm down the basement is actually doing it.
Well, the translation from philosophy to executable grammar is the real genius of the framework. Lev isn't proposing an ethics board.
Right.
He is translating Socratic humility into literal circuit topology.
Okay, wait, walk me through that mapping.
Sure. In this framework, proceed maps to a positive one state. Refuse maps to a negative one state.
Okay, standard so far.
But then pause when truth is uncertain introduces a mandatory, physically enforced third state, the zero state.
The zero state. Okay, I have to play devil's advocate on the practicality of this for a second.
Please do.
Because we live in a world that is completely optimized for acceleration. In the financial sector, high-frequency trading algorithms are literally co-located next to exchange servers just so they can shave microseconds off their trade times.
Oh yeah, every inch of fiber optic cable matters.
Because a millisecond delay equals millions of dollars gained or lost. In that kind of hyper-competitive environment, isn't introducing a mandatory pause state just a fancy way of guaranteeing you lose the race?
See, that assumption that speed is the ultimate metric of value, that is the exact premise that the tech and finance industries operate on.
It's gospel to them.
It is. And it is the exact premise that Lev's framework actively dismantles. This brings us to the operational heart of the system, the epistemic hold, which Lev refers to as the sacred zero.
The sacred zero. I love that term.
It's designed to turn hesitation from a competitive vulnerability into a structural superpower.
Okay, but how do you actually enforce a sacred zero?
What do you mean?
Well, if it's just software-like, if it's just a line of code in Python that says, if uncertainty is greater than X, then wait. A clever engineer at a hedge fund can just comment out that line of code to speed up the system, right?
Absolutely.
So how does Lev prevent the ethics module from just being bypassed when the stakes are really high?
By moving the ethics out of the software entirely and into the hardware.
Wait, into the hardware?
Yes. We are talking about physical thermodynamic enforcement. The blueprints provided in the sources outline a hardware mechanism called the window comparator.
The window comparator. Okay, visualize that for me.
You can picture it as a constitutional gate. It is a fail-closed piece of circuitry. The hardware does not inherently trust whatever the software is claiming.
It doesn't trust the software.
Right. Instead, it measures the direct physical state, such as a voltage threshold.
Let me make sure I'm really grasping the mechanics here. Are you saying the logic gate itself physically requires a specific electrical state to pass information?
Yes.
And if the software is caught in a state of conflict, the electricity literally cannot flow through the gate?
In a conceptual sense, yes. That is exactly it. The architecture requires legitimacy to be electrically verified.
That is wild.
If the system encounters moral uncertainty, conflicting operational mandates, or missing critical data, the electrical state falls outside the acceptable high or low thresholds.
It falls into the window in between.
Exactly. And when that happens, the gate fails closed. The system is physically, unavoidably forced into the sacred zero. Philosophy becomes a voltage threshold.
Philosophy becomes a voltage threshold that completely changes the paradigm.
It changes everything.
The machine can't bypass the ethics module because the ethics module is the physical gate itself. If you try to rewrite the software to ignore the uncertainty, the hardware simply refuses to process the instruction.
You can't code your way out of physics.
No, you can't. Lev has a quote regarding this that I want to bring in, actually. He says, "The epistemic hold is not a delay. It is the first honest byte ever written."
I love that.
And he follows it up with, "Doubt is not a bug in the decision loop. It is the brake that keeps certainty from running over truth."
To fully appreciate why hardwiring doubt into a system is so revolutionary, the sources draw this really heavy parallel to the work of Daniel Kahneman.
Oh, the Nobel laureate who mapped out human cognition.
Right. He famously mapped out the dual process theory of human thought. Kahneman divided it into two systems.
System 1 and System 2.
Exactly. System 1 thinking is fast, it's automatic, intuitive, heuristic-driven, and highly prone to bias.
Right. So System 1 is when you flinch and dodge a falling object without having to calculate its exact trajectory. It's just automatic.
Yeah. And System 2 thinking is slow, deliberate, analytical, computationally demanding, and effortful.
Like when you sit down to solve a complex algebra equation or, file your taxes, you have to actively concentrate.
Right. Now, if we look at modern neural networks and AI models today,
They operate almost entirely as massive, hyper-accelerated System 1 engines.
exactly, they are pattern matching at blinding speed. They're generating the most statistically likely next token or action based on heuristic training.
They don't inherently think step by step.
No, not unless heavily prompted to do so, and even then, the underlying architecture is deeply associative. What the Sacred Zero does is forcefully inject System 2 reasoning into a machine.
Okay, so paint that picture for me. When the AI is just flying along on System 1, pattern matching and making rapid-fire decisions,
Yeah.
and it suddenly hits a novel situation, say, an autonomous drone encounters a target profile it has never seen before, or a financial AI sees a bizarre spike in commodity prices.
Right. Something unexpected.
The hardware detects the drop in epistemic certainty. It halts the fast path. It routes the decision away from the associative network and forces it into a deliberate evidentiary governance path.
Yes. It literally forces the machine to think slowly. That is the
Wow.
exact mechanism. It breaks the momentum of assumption.
Think about the application of this in everyday human life. Think about a time you were absolutely furious, operating purely on System 1 emotion.
Oh, we've all been there.
And you draft this blistering, scorched earth email. You are completely certain in that moment that sending it is the right thing to do.
The absolute right thing.
But don't you wish you had a Sacred Zero button? Like a physical circuit connected to your keyboard that detected your emotional turbulence, realized your certainty was actually just adrenaline.
And forced a mandatory 10-minute hold before the send button would physically function.
Yes. During those 10 minutes, your System 2 logic kicks in, you realize the email is a terrible idea, and you delete it.
Crisis averted.
Now take that concept and scale it up from a personal inbox to a central bank managing inflation algorithms, or a defense system managing a drone swarm over a populated area.
The stakes are exponentially higher.
In those contexts, that pause isn't just a delay. It is the only structural mechanism preventing a civilization-scale catastrophe.
Absolutely. And building on that email analogy, when your System 2 kicks in during that 10-minute pause, you are engaging in internal evidentiary review.
Right, you're asking yourself, why am I doing this? What is the actual evidence supporting this action?
That is precisely what Lev's architecture requires of the machine. But it goes a crucial step further.
How?
Because it isn't enough for the system to merely pause, think, and then eventually act. If it acts, it must leave a permanent, undeniable, cryptographic trace of exactly why it made that choice.
Because if the hardware forces a pause, but the machine still operates in a black box during that pause and doesn't tell us what it evaluated.
We are still completely in the dark.
Right. We just have a slower black box.
Exactly. Which brings us to how Lev solves the memory problem. This is the concept of the glass house and the burden of proof.
The glass house.
He institutes an iron law in this framework, and it's brutally simple. No log, no action.
No log, no action. This is the introduction of the immutable ledger into the AI decision loop, right?
Yes. The framework mandates that before an artificial intelligence can execute any material action,
Like finalizing a mortgage approval, or executing a trade, or adjusting a city's power grid.
before any of that, it must cryptographically sign and anchor a decision log.
The evidence of its reasoning, the data it weighed, the rules it followed.
All of it must exist mathematically before the action is permitted to occur in reality.
I want to spend some time on how cryptographic anchoring actually works in this context, because
Yeah.
we throw around words like crypto and blockchain, and people immediately think of like speculative currencies.
Right, Bitcoin or whatever.
But here, we are talking about cryptography as a mechanism for irrefutable truth. How does the system generate this log in a way that just can't be tampered with later?
It relies on what the blueprints call the Goukassian principle. This divides the authorization process into three distinct operational artifacts:
The artifact.
the lantern, the signature, and the license.
Okay.
And these three components work in concert to create this cage of accountability around the system.
Let's puzzle through these one by one, starting with the lantern.
Okay?
The source material says the lantern illuminates truth and acts as a continuous integrity self-test. Does that mean the AI is constantly auditing its own code to make sure a third party hasn't snuck in a malware patch or altered its ethical constraints?
Exactly that. The lantern is a continuous cryptographic hash of the system's core operating mandates.
So it's constantly checking its own DNA.
Yes, it proves mathematically, that the AI has not been tampered with since its last verification, and that it is operating strictly within its assigned ethical boundaries.
And if someone messes with it?
If the code is altered even by a single character, the cryptographic hash changes and the lantern goes dark.
Okay, so the lantern proves the machine is mathematically sound and uncorrupted. Next is the signature.
The signature.
The text says the signature binds responsibility to a human soul or a verified organizational identity. How does a digital signature bind a human?
Through asymmetric cryptography. Every high-level mandate given to the AI must be signed by the private key of the human or the committee authorizing it.
Oh, wow. So there's always a name attached.
Always. This eliminates the concept of ghost decisions. When an AI makes a choice, the signature mathematically proves which human authority set the parameters that led to that choice.
Someone explicitly owns the consequence.
Yes. The system cannot act on an anonymous or unsigned mandate.
So we have the lantern proving the machine's integrity and the signature proving the human's authorization. That brings us to the license.
The license.
The license is the actual computational permission to execute the action, right? The moment the system says, yes, you can drop the soda out of the vending machine, to use a very basic analogy.
That's a really helpful way to look at it.
Right.
Think of the license as a smart contract.
Okay.
A smart contract is basically self-executing code that only runs when predetermined conditions are met.
Right.
Like your vending machine analogy. The machine only physically releases the soda if the coin slot verifies the right amount of money has been inserted.
Makes sense.
In Lev's framework, the soda is the AI's action and the coins are the lantern and the signature.
Oh, I see.
The smart contract absolutely cannot grant the license to act unless it verifies that the lantern is shining, meaning integrity is intact, and the signature is secured, meaning human authorization is logged.
And all of that is on the immutable ledger.
Exactly. If you are missing the cryptographically secured log, the smart contract flat out denies the action.
This intense obsession with memory, with logging every single variable. Why is this so central to Lev's worldview?
That's a great question.
I mean, the man is looking at the span of his own finite life, and he chooses to dedicate it to ensuring machines remember things accurately.
Well, he has a quote that I think speaks to the profound historical weight of this.
What does he say?
History is not what happened. History is what survived erasure.
History is what survived erasure. Wow.
That observation cuts to the very core of how institutional power functions. Historically, across human civilization, when a massive bureaucratic or technical system fails,
Or when it discriminates or when it causes harm.
right, what is the very first thing that happens?
The evidence disappears.
Exactly. The evidence of how the decision was made disappears. Logs are conveniently deleted, or we are told they were never kept in the first place, or they're locked behind impenetrable walls of corporate trade secret protections.
The narrative is controlled entirely by those in power.
Yes. By making the immutable decision log a physical computational prerequisite for the action to even occur, Lev is systematically dismantling the architecture of erasure.
He creates an undeniable chain of custody.
He does.
Let's ground this in a real-world scenario for you, the listener. Say you are applying for a critical business loan to keep your company afloat, or you are relying on a medical AI to approve a life-saving procedure, and the system denies you.
Okay.
Under our current paradigm, the bank or the hospital can just say, well, the algorithm reviewed your file and decided against it. It's a proprietary black box neural network, so we can't tell you exactly how it weighted the variables. Sorry.
And you have zero recourse.
Zero. But under ternary logic.
Under ternary logic, you are granted what Lev calls a legally verifiable right to evidentiary recourse.
Because the AI could not have executed the denial without first anchoring the decision log.
Exactly. That log mathematically exists. It proves exactly what data points were used, what weighting was applied, and what ethical threshold was crossed to reach the denial. You can audit the machine's reasoning step by step.
This seems like the ultimate weapon against ethics washing.
Oh, completely.
Because we see this constantly in the tech sector right now. A massive conglomerate will publish this beautiful 50-page PDF manifesto on their website about their deep commitment to AI safety and alignment.
Right, great PR.
And then 6 months later, they quietly fire their entire AI safety team, or they strip the safety constraints out of their models behind the scenes because the constraints are slowing down processing times and costing them server space.
That is the standard playbook of corporate ethics washing.
But in Lev's architecture, the lantern acts as a smart contract dead man's switch against exactly that behavior.
Yes, it does. If a corporate entity tries to quietly tamper with the safety limits to increase speed or profitability, the lantern detects the cryptographic mismatch instantly.
Because the hash doesn't match anymore.
Right. Because the integrity hash fails, the system publicly revokes their compliance status in real time on the ledger, and the license to operate halts.
They cannot fake it. The ethics are not in a PDF on a website. They are hard-coded into the execution logic.
Exactly.
All right, I need to introduce some serious friction here.
Let's do it.
I want to push back on the human element of this design. The technical architecture sounds airtight. The cryptography is mathematically sound. The hardware gates are brilliant. But no matter how perfect the code is, it ultimately interfaces with human beings. What happens if the humans operating the system are fundamentally corrupt? Let's say a rogue CEO takes over the conglomerate, or an authoritarian government seizes control of the servers running ternary logic. Can't the people with the physical guns or the ultimate executive power just coerce the engineers to bypass the system or rewrite the rules of the ledger?
How does Lev's code prevent human coercion?
Exactly.
That is the most critical vulnerability in any system, and Lev anticipated it. He knows you cannot solve human corruption with just software. So he applies a deeply historical political concept to the architecture. He designed the Tri-Cameral governance model.
Tri-Cameral governance.
He takes the separation of powers. Think of Montesquieu's theories that influence the drafting of democratic constitutions and applies it directly to the AI protocol.
Wow. Okay.
Power is fractured into 3 distinct adversarial branches that must independently verify each other.
Like an executive, legislative, and judicial branch, but for an artificial intelligence network.
Exactly.
How are the 3 branches structured?
First, you have the technical council. These are the engineers and computer scientists who maintain the physical infrastructure and ensure the code executes cleanly.
But they do not set the rules.
Right. Second, you have the stewardship custodians.
Yeah.
This is a rotating, cross-institutional body of ethicists, legal scholars, and public advocates.
And what do?
They manage the moral mandates and the acceptable thresholds for uncertainty. And third, you have the smart contract treasury, which manages the economic incentives, ensuring that the system is properly funded and that financial penalties for non-compliance are automatically executed.
But wait, if an authoritarian government holds the keys to the entire country, what stops them from just arresting the stewardship custodians and replacing them with loyalists who will sign off on whatever the government wants?
Because the protocol requires distributed multi-signature consensus across multiple jurisdictions and institutional bodies to alter the core mandates.
So it's decentralized?
Highly decentralized. If a government replaces the local custodians with sycophants, the wider network of global custodians will not cryptographically sign off on the legitimacy of the new mandates.
And without that multi-signature consensus?
The smart contract treasury will not release the license for the core system updates to proceed.
So if a corrupt finance minister attempts to force the central bank's AI to quietly print $1 billion in digital currency to fund a shadow military project.
The engineers can't just execute the code.
Right. The system would hit the epistemic hold because the mandate violates the core economic stability thresholds. It would demand multi-signature approval from the independent stewardship custodians.
And because those independent custodians wouldn't approve it, the system would refuse to issue the computational license.
While simultaneously generating a public cryptographic log of the entire attempted scheme.
Precisely. The architecture does not guarantee that bad actors won't try to seize control. What it does is make corruption highly visible, computationally expensive, and architecturally exhausting.
It forces power to operate in the light.
It does.
The elegance of that design is staggering.
Yeah.
But, sitting here in this bright room talking about the hope embedded in this technology, we also have to ground ourselves in harsh reality.
We have to acknowledge uncertainty.
Yeah. Even with the Tri-Cameral governance, even with the window comparator and the immutable ledger, will this framework actually save us?
Will it perfectly prevent the next global financial meltdown? Or stop a catastrophic failure when artificial superintelligence finally comes online?
Exactly.
If we are being intellectually honest, and if we are honoring Lev's own rigorous skepticism, we have to acknowledge that it might not.
Because complex systems are well, complex.
Right. They have a way of failing in entirely novel, unforeseeable ways. A sufficiently determined alliance of bad actors, a cascade of unpredictable black swan events, or a physical destruction of the hardware itself could still bypass or overwhelm the architecture.
It is a cage designed to hold immense power, but no cage built by humans is infinitely unbreakable.
Lev does not claim to have built a perfect utopia.
But, and this is where the philosophy of the work becomes so resonant for me, even if the framework fails to prevent a disaster, its lasting contribution to humanity is equally profound.
Because of the record it leaves behind.
Yes, it preserves a transparent, immutable record of exactly how the critical decisions were made, what variables were ignored, and where the failures originated. It leaves what Lev profoundly refers to as a living witness.
That concept of the living witness is perhaps the most poignant realization in his entire body of work.
Let's read that quote.
He writes, "The witness exists because human memory bends under power, fear, time, and grief.
Human memory bends.
If a massive tragedy does occur, we will not be left stumbling in the dark, entirely reliant on the self-serving public relations narratives of the corporations or the governments responsible.
We won't have to guess if they knew the risks.
No. We will have the cryptographic, mathematical proof of exactly what the machine knew, the exact millisecond it knew it, and the cryptographic signature of the specific human who authorized it to ignore the warnings."
We are building cages for gods. As computational power scales exponentially toward artificial superintelligence, ethical architecture becomes just as essential, if not more so, than the technical processors themselves.
Lev writes, "The cage must be stronger than the deity."
We cannot simply build an omnipotent digital entity, turn it on, and hope that it magically decides to adopt human values. We have to build structural, physical hesitation into its very being.
Which leads us to look forward, I think.
Yeah, let's forecast this. If we extrapolate from the blueprints Lev is refining today, what does a world running on ternary logic actually look like?
If this seed that he is planting in that sunlit apartment takes root, how does it grow and alter the landscape over the next 50 years?
Well, the sources offer a really compelling 50-year forecast. Let's trace that timeline.
Okay.
Initially, the major shift is in hardware. Over the next 10 to 15 years, we transition from just emulating these ternary states in software, which is how we have to test it now, to manufacturing physical delay and sensitive ternary logic coprocessors.
DITL chips?
Exactly. The chip manufacturing industry will have to adapt to print these three-state gates. Eventually, every major AI server farm, every autonomous vehicle, every defense system will physically have a conscience chip bolted to its motherboard that it absolutely cannot rewrite or bypass.
And moving into the next 25 years, the most profound impacts will likely be seen in global finance.
Right.
We will see the widespread adoption of central bank digital currencies, but not the opaque, centralized versions critics fear today.
What will they look like?
These CBDCs will execute monetary policy where legal accountability and the epistemic hold are built directly into the foundational ledger.
So you won't have algorithmic trading algorithms cascading into flash crashes.
Because when market uncertainty spikes beyond a designated threshold, the hardware across the entire exchange will physically halt. It will enforce a cooling off period, demanding human system 2 review before capital is allowed to evaporate.
And as we look 50 years out into the broader societal structure, we could see multi-agent AI economies governed entirely by the vow.
Right. You will have artificial intelligences negotiating logistics, supply chains, and legal contracts with other artificial intelligences.
They will operate almost like autonomous nation-states, but they will be bound by unbreakable digital constitutions that structurally require evidentiary weight, built-in hesitation, and absolute transparency.
And all of that forecasting leads back to the core of Lev's ultimate vision. Despite the strictness of the architecture, he isn't trying to build a digital dictatorship to control human behavior.
No, not at all.
He is trying to protect human agency from machine acceleration. He says, "My utopia has no guards at the gate, only an open door and enough light to find your own path."
He is doing the heavy, invisible labor today. He is planting these complex seeds so that strangers, generations from now, will one day pick them up, utilize them, and simply call them their own without ever needing to know his name.
Which brings this entire journey back to you, the listener.
We've spent this time exploring the mind of a living thinker, who is using his visible, highly finite time to build an ethical safety net for the rest of us.
We've puzzled through the dense architecture of assured governance, the physics of the sacred zero.
The cryptography of the immutable ledger, and the human friction of tri-cameral governance, and by walking this path, we arrive at the burden of knowing.
Because knowledge creates responsibility. Once you understand that these systems can be built this way, once you see the proof that machines can be physically forced to hesitate, to be transparent, to leave a living witness, and to structurally respect human life and difference, becomes impossible.
You now know that the technology exists to prevent artificial intelligence in global finance from operating in an unaccountable black box.
Therefore, if a tech conglomerate or a central bank or a military command chooses to build a machine that operates in the dark, they are making a deliberate choice.
It is not a technical limitation, it is an ethical evasion. They are choosing to evade accountability.
And you are now a witness to that choice.
So the question you have to carry forward is, what will you demand of the systems that govern your life, your finances, and your future?
Whether this framework ultimately claims to be the exact perfect solution or just the necessary stepping stone, its purpose is to force humanity to pause, to think more deeply, and to act more wisely before making decisions that we cannot easily undo.
It is a question that demands action, not just reflection.
Absolutely.
As the light in this room starts to shift into the afternoon and we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with the exact words of the architect himself.
A man looking directly at the future with absolute clarity, actively building, and reminding us of the immense weight of what we choose to create.
The heaviest knowledge is not knowing the answer. It is knowing the cost of asking too late.